Hello, I'm Too Tight Lit Trek, and welcome back to Glitterature Alley, your back street off the beaten path, under the radar and beyond the pale place to sparkle up your senses as we talk about all things literary. And today, I wanted to squeak in a video for Jane Austen July before it was too late. And I've dug deeply into my portmanteau and dug up one of my favorite Regency outfits from back in the day. And those were the days, weren't they? So I've been meaning to make this video for a while because a few months ago there was quite a bit of hatred directed toward Jane Austen's Emma. And it set me to thinking. But I don't know if you've noticed this, but I do live in a fantasy world. And while a little bit of literary hatred is, can be just good, clean fun, I have become aware that the world is outside of Glitterature Alley. I look down from my pedazzled perch and I see that the world actually is filled with real hatred and violence and stupidity. And to tell you the truth, it just got me down, down, down. And it was touch and go for a little while there because of the despair that engenders really does set one back a bit. But Dr. Sonnet, who he was rather worried for a while there, but I have since rallied, and while there's still a stale stench of despair in the air, one must forge ahead. So, on to the joys of Jane Austen. Now, the problem that many of the people who seem to have a problem with Jane Austen have is that, with Jane Austen in general and with Emma in particular, is that nothing happens. So today I'm calling this episode, What's Happening in Jane Austen? And as a fiction writer myself, I find the concept of action intensely interesting. Because a fiction writer needs to present a compelling situation in language that sounds good, not fake or florid unless it fits the character. And you need to create characters who seem like real people in real situations. And you need action that moves the story along organically. Action that's interesting and that leads the characters to some point of import. As a reader, I find that if I feel the presence of an author pushing characters around simply for the sake of action, I rebel and throw the book right out the window. We have bars on the window, so it just bounces back at me, but I take care of it later. But in terms of action, there is what I call big action and small action in literary fiction. And big action can take the form of travel. So for instance, in Moby Dick, where a sailor decides to become a sailor on a whaling ship, and he gets involved in a situation in which there's an obsessive, self-destructive captain who makes decisions that don't go so well for everybody else. That's a form of big action. It can also take the form of changes in fortune and the ways characters react to such change in fortune, and that is what happens in Dickens novels all the time. There are bold confrontations, and I just finished reading James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, and while that novel moves along in an episodic fashion, there are episodes for each character. But finally, when we get to the end, all of those characters have huge confrontations that keeps the plot going until we finally get to the final character's story at the end. So, but it also is part of what caused me to despair, because nothing really does change in America, it seems. But back to Jane Austen. There are also big action can occur in big life events like marriage or divorce or birth or death, and that you could find, for example, in Anna Karenina and Anna Karenina and Anna Karenina and Anna Karenina. You can find just about every kind of big action in Anna Karenina. And then there's what I call small action. And small action can manifest in a simple turn of a phrase, perhaps maybe a bad decision that leads a character to do things that the character might not have ordinarily done, or even dialogue that doesn't seem overtly confrontational, but that can have very large consequences. And Jane Austen, I contend, brings small action to high art, a form of high art. And basically what I'm actually mostly concerned about in Emma, what really happens to the reader. And that's what I find most thrilling. As readers, we are also creators. The words come to us and we create the scene, and we create as much as we can of what the writer has given us, which is why I always watch a movie after I've read a book, because I don't want those images polluting my brain. I want to be able to create the characters on my own from what the author has given me. And the writer Frank Conroy is famous for a graphic that he used to draw on the board to teach writers how to become good writers. And there's the writer on this side and the reader on this side. And he says that the writer has to come at least halfway for the reader, because the reader ends up coming halfway to create what the writer has presented. But if the writer goes too far over, it's a little too much telling and not enough showing. And if the reader holds back too much, the reader can't quite get to the point where they know what's going on. So the perfect thing is to meet in the middle. And a novel like Emma, that's masterfully constructed of small action, needs an extra bit of attention. It can't be gobbled up in one sitting. So for instance, if you read the book, this edition, it's a Penguin Classics edition, edited with an introduction and notes by Fiona Stafford, is almost 400 pages. So if you read this in one sitting, overnight, because you can't sleep, chances are you're not doing the book or yourself justice. So please don't gobble up literature in one sitting, especially 400 pages of Jane Austen. It does nobody any good. So Emma is a comedy of manners, I think, or I would say. Comedy of manners is generally applied to drama, but it's a novel of manners, and it's a comedy in the Shakespearean sense that there will be a marriage at the end, we already know that. And manners, because it looks at the imperfect characters and the way they interact with one another in a circumscribed place. So whether that circumscribed place is a duke's estate in Sicily, as we have in Much Ado About Nothing, or in the village of Highbury, where Emma Woodhouse is of first consequence, we're told. What really happens in Emma is the education of Emma. On the surface, it's a book about a spoiled, snotty young woman who gets her jollies trying to be a matchmaker, even though she herself announces that she has no desire to be matched with anyone ever. Very much like Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, as a matter of fact. She pokes her nose into other people's business to give romantic help, for which nobody is asked, and she botches it again and again. But this is complicated by the fact that while she actually is a spoiled, snotty busybody, she's also very smart, very funny, and mostly good-hearted, and all of her intrigues are truly meant to make other people happy. So it's a complicated mix. She's not just an evil person. She doesn't do things purposely to hurt people, even though people get hurt from her good intentions. And in the education of Emma, her teachers are primarily her own mistakes. Her distress at her failings and her realization that she's not as smart or as good as she thinks or wants to be is what drives the novel. So the book moves forward with constant pulses of self-awareness, with every seeming success and every setback. And because it's told in very close third-person narration, it has the effect of educating the reader right along with Emma, almost right apace with Emma. And we find out her better and worse qualities almost at the same time she does. The other thing that happens in Emma is the language. And I do believe that speech is action. And because of the close third-person narration, even the observations in the book move us along, since they are filtered through Emma's viewpoint. So we get Emma moving the action along with her own observations. And while there isn't a page in this book that I wouldn't want to quote, in the interest of time, because we do not have all day, I will focus on the way that she creates character, because without character, there is no action. So Matthew at Mayberry Book Club was enormously repelled by the way that Jane Austen creates character in these. She introduces her characters with just big, broad strokes and leaves it at that. But I find that completely confounding, because I think that that is one of Jane Austen's points of true genius. She will introduce a character in broad strokes, but they're so specific, and when you hear those broad strokes and then you see a character act, you know that that character is being true to what she has described. And when you hear that same character speak, it's also true to the description that she gave in a very concise and precise description at the beginning. So the first character that I'm going to look at is Mr. Woodhouse, Emma's father. The book opens with a wedding, the wedding of Emma's governess, Miss Taylor, and previously, years earlier, Emma's older sister has gotten married too, and Mr. Woodhouse does not like weddings, we come to find out. By his constitution and habits, he's been a valetudinarian all his life without activity of mind or body. So he was a much older man in many ways than in years. And though everywhere beloved for the friendliness of his heart and his amiable temper, his talents could not have recommended him at any time. His spirits required support. He was a nervous man, easily depressed, fond of everybody that he was used to, and hating to part with them, hating change of every kind. Matrimony, as the origin of change, was always disagreeable, and he was by no means yet reconciled to his own daughter's marrying, nor could ever speak of her but with compassion, though it had been entirely a match of affection, when he was now obliged to part with Miss Taylor too. And from his habits of gentle selfishness, and of being never able to suppose that other people could feel differently from himself, he was very much disposed to think of Miss Taylor, that Miss Taylor had done as sad a thing for herself as for them. And that description, his habits of gentle selfishness, and never being able to suppose that other people could feel differently from himself, it's borne out in every instance that we see him later on in the book, and I find it a tremendously interesting and funny way of describing a father. And then we get also Harriet Smith, who is Emma's friend, who we learn Harriet Smith was the natural daughter of somebody. And by natural, of course, that means illegitimate. And for someone to describe her friend that way is quite cutting, and it shows the snottiness that Emma has, that she really does feel superior to everyone, even people who she ends up befriending and really quite loving. So that's interesting. But then we come upon Miss Bates. I'll give you two more examples. There's Miss Bates and Mrs. Elton. And I could do hours about Miss Bates and the way that Jane Austen has created this character, but I won't. I will say, though, that because this is third person, close third person narration, we actually get a better description of Emma than we do of Miss Bates, because we see that this is filtered through Emma's eyes, and we see the kind of bitchiness that's coming from Emma in this description of Miss Bates. Miss Bates had no intellectual superiority to make atonement to herself or frighten those who might hate her into outward respect. It was her own universal goodwill and contented temper which worked such wonders. The simplicity and cheerfulness of her nature, her contented and grateful spirit, were a recommendation to everybody and a mine of felicity to herself. She was a great talker upon little matters, which exactly suited Mr. Woodhouse, full of trivial communications and harmless gossip. And this is one of Jane Austen's great strokes of genius. She is able to create this character, Miss Bates, whose monologues are incredibly boring and ridiculous, and Jane Austen somehow makes them totally entertaining and really quite funny, because we're seeing it from Emma's point of view, and there are a few points where Emma herself actually mocks Miss Bates in front of other people, and it's quite funny. And then at one point it goes too far, but I won't talk about that. Then we come upon Mrs. Elton. Later in the novel, Mr. Elton gets married to this woman, and we hear the description of her. And this is the power of understatement, or just bitchiness. Mrs. Elton was first seen at church, but though devotion might be interrupted, curiosity could not be satisfied by a bride in a pew, and it must be left for the visits in form which were then to be paid to settle whether she were very pretty indeed, or only rather pretty, or not pretty at all. And there we actually get a description of the village and the people in the village, of whom one is Emma Woodhouse. We find out later, after she does pay her visit to Emma, that Mrs. Elton was a vain woman, extremely well satisfied with herself, and thinking much of her own importance, that she meant to shine and be very superior, but with manners which had been formed in a bad school, pert and familiar, that all her notions were drawn from one set of people and one style of living, that if not foolish, she was ignorant, and that her society would certainly do Mr. Elton no good. And obviously you can hear Emma's voice in that. Now, one of my very favorite points in this book comes at the very beginning, before Mr. and Mrs. Elton marry, when Emma's trying to make a match between Harriet and Mr. Elton, who has not been married yet. And she botches it completely, and there's a point where it comes out that Mr. Elton is actually interested in Emma and not in Harriet at all, and this makes everybody miserable. And after that confrontation scene in the coach, where Emma finds out that this is what's going on, and that she has to tell Harriet that she's been setting her up thinking that Mr. Elton is going to be falling in love with her, that chapter ends, and we get this beginning. Emma comes home and she's just miserable. She's just miserable. The hair was curled, and the maid sent away, and Emma sat down to think and be miserable. Now, that's an incredibly beautiful opening, because it's witty and it's sharp and it's weird. How miserable could she be? She has someone to curl her hair for her. She has a maid to take care of her needs, and yet she sits down to think and be miserable because she's left with her own thoughts. And she is miserable because she's beginning to realize that what she's done is a horrible thing. And this chapter in itself, I mean, she becomes aware that everything that has happened is all her fault, and everybody around her knows that it's all her fault. And she comes to the ugly truth, but only after first attempting to talk herself out of the fact that this is actually what has happened. It's a masterpiece of vacillation. It's a masterpiece of seeing a character become self-aware, denying that self-awareness, lapsing into the habit of self-assurance, and then catching herself in her own foolishness again. And it's a tremendously intelligent and understated way of showing Emma at her best and her worst at the same time. You can see this intelligent little snot understanding that she's an intelligent little snot and that she's messed everything up. All of her best intentions have been the misery of many people, and that's a hard fact to swallow. So even when we get to the point where the big action comes in, and this big action contradicts Emma's previous resolution that she will never fall in love with anyone ever, we get this almost comically understated declaration of love, where instead of an effusive, florid, bated breath, I love you, I love you, I love you, Jane Austen tells us this about Emma's reaction. What did she say? Just what she ought, of course. A lady always does. It's just so concise and beautiful, and she circumvents the whole trope of like, oh, I'm in love, I'm in love, I'm in love, and it's just beautiful and beautifully done, and it works very well for this character, and it fits right in, and you know, big action does finally come into it. So Jane Austen's keen eye for detail, her ear for language, her talent for understatement, her wit and her intelligence, and her ability to create characters that seem real with human faults and advantages as well, in language that's as witty and real and cutting and concise as Shakespeare's, I contend, proves that she was a writer who knew how to pay attention to all the wonders that were in her world. Take a hint from Jane Austen. You'll only be better for reading her. Until we meet again, I'm Glitterature. Mwah.